I want to thank you all for being here. I'm Eric Tanenblatt, and I am with the global law firm Dentons. We're the largest law firm in the world, and I also head our firm's global autonomous vehicle practice, which is why I'm excited to be here today. For those of you that had an opportunity to hear Filip, we're going to continue the conversation with him and the other panelists. And for those that have just joined us, you're in for a treat when you hear some of the things that Filip's doing with Einride. But let me introduce our other panelists that are with us today. Malloy is with Cox Automotive Mobility Group. And then we have Ashley Horvat, who is with Greenlots. And we're going to have a discussion today about EV adoption from fleets to retail. The Electrification of America is what the session is entitled. And what I would like to do is, since we have such interesting panelists, I'd like to get each of them to take about 30 seconds to introduce themselves. But in introducing themselves, I'd also like them to each start with answering a question related to EV adoption. And in particular, as some of you know, the U.S. Department of Energy says that by 2028, battery costs are going to decline. That's going to make EVs as economically preferable as internal combustible engine vehicles. So how long after that point do you think EV adoption will become more prevalent here in not just America, but globally?
Yeah, nice to meet everybody, and thank you for welcoming Greenlots here. We're excited to be a part of the first entry of this conference into the U.S. I had a chance to attend it in 2013 in Barcelona, so it's come a long way. But in terms of, I guess I'll start with the introduction and then get into the answer. My role at Greenlots is Vice President of Partnerships, and Greenlots is, if you don't know, definitely go over to our beautiful exhibit out there that we have, but we're an EV charging technology company, and we were recently acquired by Shell, but prior to that we started in Singapore in 2008, and we moved over to the US, and our headquarters are in LA. I was employee number 17, and we have close to 200 now, and so we've grown quite a bit in the last couple of years, but Greenlots has been very active in this space for quite some time, and I would say they've done quite a bit with a little, and we've helped to grow the market in ways that other companies haven't, in the sense that we strongly believe in utility involvement, and we did early on believe that in order to scale the market to the level that we need to in order to achieve some of the laudable goals that many of the cities here have, you really need utility scale involvement, and especially in communities that might not have the resources to bear to really encourage that private investment. So, my background in the industry is I've been in the industry for about a decade, started about the first part of that in the public sector, and it kind of ties into your question as to how long it's going to take before we get to where we need to go. I mean, I've seen quite a bit of progress, and I think where we're at now in terms of an inflection point is really a critical juncture, and I think with the acquisition of Greenlots, I think that does signal a pretty significant sophistication of the industry, and importantly, the automakers are investing quite a bit. You may have seen recently Cox investment in Rivian, and several other companies are coming out with other types of electric vehicle models. And so with the decrease in the battery costs being one of the drivers, I think once the awareness of the models that are available, it will certainly be critical. But one of the other key pieces that I'm hoping to cover during today's session is the other elements. One of which is the investment on the private side of things. Two is market signals from cities that are here today and other partners, and then utility involvement. So Bloomberg estimates, EEI estimates we need 5 million ports to accommodate the 7 million EVs by 2025. And that's a lot of ports that we need to get to. So there's a lot of work to be done both on the regulatory side of things as well as the implementation. So there's a lot of different moving parts that are going to be necessary to have in place to get to that. So.
Lee?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Malloy, and I'm excited to be here today. I'm with, just as Eric said, Cox Automotive Mobility. I run our emerging technology within Cox Automotive Mobility's team, and we're focused on enabling what we call the ACES future. Many of you may be familiar with that term, but we believe that transportation in the future is defined by autonomous, connected, electric, and shared vehicles. And we want to help the industry set up to both transform and thrive in this new future through both physical and digital services. And we bring a lot of experience to the table with our network of 73 physical auctions today that do vehicle processing for millions of vehicles a year. And a lot of my focus is on battery technology as well as setting up to support the electric fleet. To answer Eric's question, it's a tough one, right? None of us have a crystal ball, per se, and all of the things that Ashley mentioned are absolutely right. We've changed the debate or the conversation from if electric vehicles will take hold to when, which is a great transformation. Consumer confidence and awareness and openness is an all-time high. We're seeing massive capital inflows into the space. We're seeing a maturing supply chain around electric vehicles and a ton of government and municipality support. So we have all the right factors in play, I believe. Then it just becomes a question of, how quickly will the vehicle car park turn over? And one data point on the US side is we have about 240 million vehicles in what we define as our passenger car park, and each of those vehicles is in our car park for about 10 years. So just doing that simple math, we know we have a couple years to true material adoption, but we're excited and really bullish in what the future holds for electric.
Thank you. Philip?
Yes, hi, my name is Filip, for you who weren't here earlier, and I represent Einride. And we develop an autonomous transport system that's both cost disruptive and sustainable. And in regards to your questions, I do believe that the transition will go quite fast, but we will live with different types of vehicles for quite a long time, because it's also up to the personal preferences. Some types of cars will be around, sports cars, for example, which I like, but those people who uses the car most will be the ones who quickest change to an electric, just to pure numbers. And that's the same for the commercial vehicles. It's pure numbers. The economics will make sure that the transition go fast.
Philip, I know you answered this in the previous session, but we have some new people here, and I would be interested. Can you also talk about why your company chose to focus on industrial vehicles as opposed to consumer vehicles?
Because the market is already there. It's less complex traffic situations, for example. It's outside the city limits. We have no people inside our trucks, for example, and the flows are very predictable. It doesn't, let's say, it doesn't require the flexibility that other customers need. And the market is there for us, so it's time to market. Yeah.
Thank you. And Lee and Ashley, I want you both to answer this question in sort of a softball, because you are so involved in this. But since we're here at a Smart Cities conference, what can cities do to prepare for electric autonomous vehicles?
One easy answer is education, right? And support the consumer in understanding the options around both electric and autonomous that are out there, and introduce ways to get the consumer more familiar with those technologies. We think about autonomous vehicles in the future as being electric, so we see those as one and the same. Cox Automotive has done some great research over the past year on mobility, and we've got some research specifically on the path to EV adoption that just came out about a month ago. And a couple of those data points stuck with me about EV adoption. And what it told us is that the consumer is still carrying some skepticism about the battery. They have questions around how healthy is this battery, how long will this battery last? And another obstacle for the consumer that we found is really the cost of the EV. And to some extent, that's a little bit of a misconception, because what we've seen in the marketplace is that the cost of the EV over the last 7 years has stayed about stagnant or level, whereby its gasoline or internal combustion engine counterparts, the prices of those vehicles in the retail market has actually risen about 19%. So between battery skepticism and overcoming some cost barriers, I think those are some great ways that we can start to introduce education and confidence around the EV transaction.
Thank you. Yes,
Same
sure.
question? Okay. Yeah, there's definitely a lot that cities can do, and I think, we've tried to develop really good, curated ideas for cities that can be scaled, not just in one particular city, but I think what we've come to realize is every city does have its own unique identity, and so I think there's really, really important key things. I think one thing is I don't want it to seem like the market is at a point now where everything is going to be done in the private sector. There's been quite a bit of government funding over time with the Appendix D funding and the stimulus bill in the earlier days that helped kind of set the stage, but in a lot of cases, the funding went out and that infrastructure wasn't ideally deployed. Maybe it wasn't in the right location, maybe the company isn't around, and so I think it's really important to kind of visualize your city and come at it from a fresh perspective in 2019 and really think about how mobility has shifted. And what helps on the private side of things for us is for the city to have a really succinct idea of where they want to go and where we can fit into that. And so laying out that vision for us is number one. And what that means is getting your house in order, figuring out the different departments, making sure they talk to each other, making sure they answer the phone when other departments call, because we've had issues where like procurement won't answer the phone from this department. It's like, we can't fix that. I mean, I can try to help. But that's really helpful. And then from there, from beyond the structural, it's market signals, which I mentioned earlier. So like if a city is working really closely with an airport and they're thinking really holistically about how not only their residents, but how people travel into the city, how people work and operate within a region. So for an example, in Atlanta, they've really had strong commitments on the fleet side of things, and they've also passed an ordinance, which is another strong signal that there has to be EV ready. But it also helps for a city to have commitment on not just vehicles, but infrastructure, right? And thinking about TNCs like Uber and Lyft, and really thinking about it from a comprehensive perspective. And that tells us as a private sector company where we need to invest our own resources. And so that's really helpful. So beyond the policy and regulatory, it also helps for a city to be in a state with really strong utility involvement, so I would highly encourage that integration. And then beyond that, it does help to be a ZEV, what's called a ZEV state. So the automakers are required to bring the cars into the state. If you don't have that, I would highly encourage collaboration with your local dealers to make sure that the supply is there, because no matter how great the work you do on the policy side and all of the stakeholder engagement, if the cars aren't there and ready to be purchased, it's going to be really difficult to make that final sale.
Are there any cities that stand out to you that Greenlots has worked with that you think are at the forefront?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's been widely out there that we do work really closely with LA, and they've done a great job. But I would say Columbus has done a great job, Atlanta, Houston. Some of them are in the earlier stages of where we'd like to see them be, but they're doing the really important work, which is to say that they're figuring out where they want to be in 5 years, and so that when they are ready to go ahead and activate any programs, they've done their due diligence on the procurement side of things, and they figured out all of the appropriate stakeholders. I think you'll start to see some unlikely heroes maybe in this story in all parts of the country, and that's exciting. We're seeing activity. But I would say one of the things that I think is really helpful for a city is when, like in LA, they have this organization called LACY. It's the LA Clean Tech Incubator. And then in Columbus, they have the Columbus Partnership. And those type of, and Houston is building one as well. So I think when you have an organization that like pushes action, not just within the city, it kind of gives cover in a political way, but also in a way that keeps people, even when they switch jobs, but they're still in the region, that they care about making that happen.
And Lee, what are a few of the most challenging use cases for autonomous vehicles to navigate actually dense urban areas? I mean, you've got some serious challenges within some of the cities as it relates to autonomous technology. So how have you seen cities start to prepare for that?
Well, again, I think it really starts with the consumer and helping shape those consumer perceptions, not to dismiss the technological and societal, challenges of enabling an autonomous fleet or autonomous vehicles, but we think the consumer has a little catching up to do to even be comfortable getting behind the wheel of an autonomous vehicle or in the passenger seat. The awareness we know of autonomy and autonomous vehicles has risen recently, but the consumer's readiness to get into an autonomous vehicle is actually declining. And we think in part because of some high-profile accidents with passengers on autopilot, coupled with some of the technological innovation inside the vehicle. Most new vehicles today have what's called level 2 autonomous features. They're piloted driving, automatic emergency braking with steering assist, lane departure with steering assist. So some consumers are happy and satisfied with those features as it is and may not understand why the need exists for them to be a fully autonomous vehicle like a robotaxi. So there's those set of consumer sentiments that really need to shape legislation and policy. And then there's a whole bunch of technological challenges, right? Just the size and the number of data packets required for a vehicle to communicate, as well as the technology to really understand all of the scenarios that the human brain processes really well, but that computers don't do as well at, whether it's the well-known example of the white background on a truck and or chickens crossing the road or pedestrians who are a little bit hard to predict in terms of their behavior. So I think it's really this collage of consumer perception at the forefront, but also this host of technological challenges with the software and the capability and its communication infrastructure.
Do you also see a decline? I mean, I know there's statistics that show there's a decline in personal car ownership, especially among young people, and they want to, they move to ride sharing or transportation alternatives. So do you see that as an opportunity for autonomous fleets? Or do you think we're still a ways away from something like that happening?
I believe, and Cox Automotive believes, that the future is the autonomous electric fleet. And part of what's driving that transition is consumer economics, right? So the cost to buy a new car is in the $60,000, well, $35,000 for the average new car. The median average household income has been stagnant. The math just doesn't pencil. So consumers are rational and looking for other options to either do subscription or other car share services, such as rideshare. So economics is a really big driver. And then there's just the convenience factor of not having to worry about your maintenance and your insurance and all the other components that go into it. So what we're seeing play out in the marketplace and what we're also forecasting is, today the average family might have 2.1 vehicles in their driveway. Tomorrow, that average family of 4 may only need 1 vehicle in their driveway, and they satisfy their mobility either through ride share, car share, subscription, public transportation, bike, scooter, you name it. So I think it's a multitude of forces at play, but economics is at the forefront.
Philip, we were talking before the panel about the highly regulated environment we have here in the United States. Yeah. Since you're the panelist that's not from the United States, what is your perspective on how other countries are preparing for electrification, autonomous vehicles? How does it compare to what we have here in the United States?
Well, the United States is quite similar to Europe because different states has different legislation and different countries in Europe has different legislation. But China is leading the way. And I do believe that cities must also understand that there is a business case behind this, not just consumer economics, it's also for the cities, because a smart and efficient transport system makes the cities more competitive. Because traffic jams, for example, are hurting the effect of transport. It hurts cities. So a smooth and smart traffic system, transport system will, in the end, benefit the cities.
Ashley, do you want to add, since I know you started in Singapore, your company started in Singapore, what is your perspective in terms of the United States versus the rest of the world?
Yeah, I think we're living in a really unique political climate right now in the U.S. as compared to, we've been compared to the traction that China has had, and I think in some ways it's a fair comparison, but in others it's a bit more difficult to make the kind of policy proclamations that China can. But I think Norway would be another good example in terms of a country that's seen some success with regards to electrification. And I think some of that is just down to the kind of drivers. Gas is more expensive there. They get free ferries. I mean, some of those like behavioral incentives are real drivers for adoption, and there's just more awareness, and they've seen it. There's a lot of cities in the U.S. that are pretty envious of Norway. They've electrified their ferries. We hosted them in Seattle, looking at kind of a similar electrification of ferries. So the Netherlands is also another area of the world that has really seen some success with EVs. But I definitely think the U.S. is a thought leader for sure, especially on the regulatory side of things. When I was in that world, we hosted several delegations and met with China and New Zealand and all of these other places that were really envious of kind of what the U.S. had in regards to ZEV regulations and have largely modeled it. I think where they can be quicker than us is the implementation, but I think long term we need to continue to try to pursue remaining competitive in the world in terms of attracting businesses. And we've definitely seen that in the U.S. And, we're continuing to grow our team. We are completely committed to the industry. We're seeing more and more investment. So I think hopefully we can see some more competition. But yeah.
How do you deal with the challenge of skeptics with regards to electric vehicles in terms of the distance the car can go when you're dealing with, say, legislators that are rural legislators that are making decisions that not only impact their communities but also urban centers?
Yeah, I don't deal with them. No, just kidding. No, we work really closely with different communities. And actually, some of the work that I did in the earlier days was very focused on rural. And we worked with several state agencies, and we kind of took it more from an economic development and tourism perspective. But where that turned is when we would put charging infrastructure into these connecting communities, what we would see was you'd start to see a radius around those chargers where local businesses would install level 2s. And so you really saw some engagement from the communities. And some of the communities, like in the Pacific Northwest, for example, were heavily reliant on timber payments. And when that went away, because logging went to the southeast, some of the operations, they were really hurt. And so they've looked at this as an economic development tourism opportunity, and we're seeing that in Tennessee and in other states throughout the country. So I think rural communities are definitely engaged. In terms of your question about the range, I definitely think that is changing. It's becoming a little bit more, I don't want to say a non-issue, but we certainly don't want to push technology that doesn't work for somebody's day-to-day commute. We don't want to, for them to have a bad experience. So I think it's probably better if somebody who has driving habits that wouldn't accommodate the current suite of EVs, certainly we wouldn't want to push them into that. But that's why we're growing the charging infrastructure. There's potential funding coming through DOT, through a federal highway appropriation, and that'll help with rural corridors. But I have to say, it is tough from a private sector perspective to make the business case work to put in charging infrastructure without support. You really need the utilization on the fast chargers to make it make sense. Level 2s maybe wouldn't work for a rural community because you aren't going to stay there very long unless you live there. So there's just all different types of considerations, but it's certainly still expensive to install infrastructure, so it's important that we can kind of make the business case. So that's where utilities come in, because they have, the onus is on them to provide service to all of the communities within their territory. And so I think that's why it's extremely important to ensure they have the tools necessary and the approval from the regulatory environment to make that happen.
Did you want to comment on that? I saw you shaking your head.
A couple of things resonated. One, the range of the EV, it's a big point of, I guess, consumer skepticism and range anxiety, so to speak. But within the automotive industry and with the introductions of a new really breed of EVs that will come in the next, say, 18 months to 2 years, by and large, at a price point that is much more palatable, range has become much less of an issue as these EVs are coming off the production lines with north of 200-mile ranges. So that does change the conversation to some extent too. But we have work to do, I think, domestically, just with some of the mechanics and math behind the supply to the grid, right? And as we start to drive EV adoption, how much more demand are those EVs going to place on the grid, and what do those forecasts look like? And we've got, working with the Department of Energy and its national lab, NREL in Golden, Colorado, it's also a consumer perception, we believe, that real energy demand or energy, brownout scenario is several years off, that the grid actually has 20 to 38% additional capacity to support EVs in the short term. And it will place new onus on the infrastructure in terms of peak demand times, and also require partnerships from the public utilities to really provide more supply, if that makes sense. But the world is changing very fast, and technological advancements are there. And even within the battery cell chemistry, we're seeing more progress towards solid state, which will allow, once that's a commercializable form of a battery, it'll allow much more energy density and thus range for the electric vehicle.
And Philip, it's real quick because the panel's coming to a close. When you think about cities and what you all are doing with freight and autonomous trucks, how do you deal with some of the challenges in urban centers with autonomous trucks? Some of the...
Can you repeat the question? Because I could...
Yeah, how are you planning for some of the challenges in urban centers with autonomous trucks, given some of the challenges we already have with traffic in urban centers?
The connectivity is very important for us. So partners that can supply us with dedicated 5G networks, for example, working with the cities, for the cities to have special lanes. They're called pool lanes today. You could have special lanes for autonomous vehicles. And I believe that no-go zones for autonomous vehicles are also important. Let's say you're not allowed to drive an autonomous vehicle outside a daycare center, for example. So keep it simple.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank the panelists. It's very fascinating. You all have some really great insight into not just trucking, but the whole area of electric vehicle charging infrastructure and what's going to happen in the future with AVs and electric vehicles. So let's give a round of applause for the panelists. Thank you.